Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel today with the Dungeons & Dragons Online team. If you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons Online, we are an online action RPG. We bring the beloved tabletop D&D game to life with real-time fighting, really great dungeons, and the particular stars of the show are monsters. So today we are going to be talking monsters. If you've never tried DDO before, or if you play DDO and you're interested in getting some fun, free stuff, we'll be giving away some goodies. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the team. So joining us today, we have our senior game designer, Charles Miles, on the content side of the fence.
Hello.
We have Brent Walton, who is a senior game designer and works a lot in our game systems.
Hello.
We have Eric Deans, who is also senior game designer. He is a dungeon creator and also works a lot in our art.
Hello, everybody.
We have Daniel Newman, who is one of our 3D artists, joining us today.
Hello.
And we also have a special guest with us. This is Sean Rowe from the Wizards of the Coast team. He is one of their producers. Say hi, Sean.
Hello, I'm not that special.
Special to us. And then I am the producer of Dungeons & Dragons Online. My name is Amanda Grove, so thanks for joining us. Now, we brought special gifts because it's PAX time. So up on the screen, you will see a code, which is DDO PAX 24. If you apply this code to your DDO account, this will add the Slice of Life Adventure Pack to your account. So when Slice of Life comes out next week, it'll automatically be on your account for you. So you will get to enjoy it for free. This is part of our ongoing Year of the Dragon celebration. D&D is celebrating its 50th anniversary. We are celebrating our 18th. So please feel free to use the code and enjoy some free content. Now, here's some of the topics we're going to be covering today when it comes to monster creation. What we're trying to do is give you an idea of how we make our creatures from the very beginning all the way through when you get to fight them in game. So we'll be going through all of these different topics today. We're going to start off at the beginning with the ideation phase. So on the screen here, you can see some artwork that comes from the D&D books, two of the very well-known monsters. And so I think the best way to start is to think about how did these monsters even end up in the books in the first place? So, Sean, what kinds of things do you have to think about when you make monsters for a tabletop encounter to make sure that the monster will be fun?
Sure. I do want to specify my title was producer on that opening slide. I'm not a producer on the tabletop RPG studio. I am a producer on our digital licensed games team. So I'm not in every meeting where every monster has been made, but I've got a pretty good idea of how they come about it. And the real answer is that a good monster idea can come from anywhere. Sometimes we'll notice that there's a gap in a certain archetype of a fight. Oh, you know, if there's an undead fight underwater, we're missing kind of that half a CR. We need like a really easy to kill minion, and we don't really have a good one there. Or sometimes it might just be somebody will make a cool doodle and they'll say, I don't know what this guy is, but he looks really cool. Let's try to make this into a monster to fulfill an archetype. Sometimes we think of a cool mechanic. Hey, what if a monster did this as its move? What does it look like? What kind of a monster is it? So there's really no limit, and it's kind of just up to the imaginations of the tabletop studio. And I can't think of a way to design a monster that hasn't originated from like a different area. There's really no limits to where a good monster idea can come from.
Now, when the Wizards team's reviewing monsters that DDO brings to life, how do you strike the balance between what the lore says the monster does and what can be done in a video game?
Sure, obviously there's a big difference when, you know, the TTRPG is turn-based and DDO is not. So there's that introduces a lot of different things into the mix, but the basic rule that we run by is the rule of cool, which most people are familiar with. If it's awesome, let's let it happen. There's certainly times where people will say, hey, this is what we want to do, and we'll look at it and we'll say, oh, this beholder looks a little derpy, let's try to make him scarier, or the displacer beast doesn't have enough arms. Those are the kinds of things we look for to make sure it lines up with the brand. And if somebody wants to do something that doesn't line up with the Dungeon Master's Guide, if there's a good reason for it and it's a better experience for players, we usually allow it.
Now, Charles, how do we pick what monsters we put in DDO?
Well, first we think about where we're going. What's our next expansion pack? Where is it set? Forgotten Realms, Eberron, someplace else? what's the story? And sometimes thinking about the monsters helps tell us what the story will be. For example, in our first Sharn expansion, we settled on the Forge Wraith very early on, and that helped us answer the questions about the story, because we asked questions like, oh, how did these Forge Wraiths come to be? What caused the industrial accident that created them, and so on. Our next expansion is going to take place in Mythdraenor, which is, of course, elven ruins in the Forgotten Realms. So we've been looking at source material based there, things like the second edition Ruins of Mythdraenor box set, and picking out monsters that are unique to Mythdraenor. Things like Fang Dragons, Blazing Bones, Baelnorns. The other thing we do is look at what are the most iconic Dungeons & Dragons monsters? What are the monsters from the monster manual that you want and expect to see in a video game? And we pick out some for each expansion that fit the setting that are also just classic monsters. This time around, we've got some things like carrion crawlers, a classic jump out from behind a corner type of monster, as well as the Hydra, a much bigger monster and one that is always very memorable in tabletop because you have to come up with a plan for all those heads.
Yeah, and then you can see, if you're not familiar with a carrion crawler, that is the brownish one there on the left. It's very exciting looking. So that's one of the critters that we're going to be adding to our upcoming expansion. And we're going to be showing you the beginning to end of how that monster comes into being, into DDO. And on the right is a classic version, classic image of the purple worm, which many players, I'm sure, have fought the purple worm before. So here you'll see the carrion crawler doing several different actions. You can see each element of how we construct one of the creature's attacks. Brent, how do we capture the essence of the creature against the mechanics when we're building, and how do we figure out the gameplay of it from the book into DDO?
I mean, we kind of start with, like, what is the quintessential thing the creature does? Like, you know, if you were in a pen and paper session, what was the thing that, like, you know, made the action happen? So in the carrion crawler's case, it's a monster that rolls 8 attacks around that can paralyze you, which is actually kind of terrifying in a pen and paper setting. But it's also like a low CR monster. So we kind of start with that, you know, really, like, you know, big focus on that ability to start with. This particular case, we're looking at probably like, well, we probably don't want to paralyze in every attack because with so many attacks, it's almost a certainty to land one and the player will fail saving throw. So we might do something gradual like we did with the Medusa, where we'll have it slow you as as the paralysis takes over gradually, giving the player time to react or drink a potion. But like if it keeps landing hits and the player doesn't respond in time, it will eventually paralyze you with those tentacles. At the same time, while we want to deliver that core mechanic, because DDO is a different game than pen and paper, and often the monster has to be in situations that are unmanaged, as in there isn't a dungeon master there to kind of mitigate things. We might give them something like a spit attack, so they're not completely helpless in a ranged situation, which is what we see here in this image.
Awesome. So here's an example of the original art in the book of a Hydra. And on the right, you'll see the actual 3D version of the Hydra currently. Eric, how do we envision what our characters will look like in 3D? How do we start thinking about how they're going to move or act in the world?
Well, usually we start with what we're presented with from art from the actual source books, and then you start comparing that to how animals or creatures work in reality. That already things like the Hydra in the example has very feline structure when it comes to his legs and arms, so we use that as a base. We just start paying attention to some other anatomical things like how do you connect 5 neck spines to one torso? How do you deal with how would they get in the way of each other and how would they move?
Yeah, and then what do we do if part of the monster isn't shown in the book? Dan?
Sure. So every monster is a unique challenge, and sometimes that challenge doesn't become apparent until you actually begin working on it. For example, the Hydra. There's going to be this mechanic where you actually sever the head of the Hydra, and it falls off and flops on the ground. Now, the poor artist that had to work on this creature encountered a variety of questions that are a bit unusual. For example, what does Hydra meat look like? What color is that meat? What does it ooze? Will I get in trouble if I search for medical neck cross-section in Google? These questions always pop up, and it's, in general, it's some combination of consulting the lore and making a best guess.
Now, when it comes to the art, you obviously are creating these monsters to be 3D objects, and so what's the process we do to sort of sculpt them out? It looks like here we've got an example of sort of the in-process of a carrion crawler.
Yeah, sure. So as a 3D artist, we do our best to interpret the 2D illustration as a believable 3D model. So the process for me begins in the program called ZBrush. ZBrush it's a lot like working with a digital ball of clay. It's very expressive and organic. So we initially begin with this kind of, I call it the lumpy potato stage at first. You kind of work in the very general form of the monster, and gradually you begin working through the different levels of hierarchy, adding more and more detail. And by the end, you're adding very small details, things like individual scales or wrinkles. For example, with this carrion crawler, I was trying to, infuse it with that very insectoid, grubby sort of aesthetic.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you. So by the end of that, we have this very high poly model. We can't just plop that right into the game engine. It would totally break everything. So we actually have to make a second 3D model, much simpler, a lot fewer polygons, and it has to have meaningful topology so that it will deform correctly in engine. And we actually bake all that high poly detail into the low poly model, and there are a variety of other steps after that, but by that stage, you're in good shape.
Now, meanwhile, while the artists are working on this in parallel, we have on the systems and combat side of the fence, the team is doing work as well. So Brent, how do we translate from the source material the statting? When we're looking at something like a purple worm, how do we figure out the numbers for something like that?
So, we take into account if it's like a large form monster or if it's a small monster. Is it a singular threat like the purple worm? You're probably not going to encounter a swarm of purple worms, we hope. But you'll be fighting one large, creature. The purple worm technically is two creatures because the tail is sort of an independent creature that we spawn and you can hack off. So it's going to have a lot more hit points than, say, a monster you might encounter as an individual and a part of a pack of 6. It'll hit harder. If it has any base characteristics from the rule book, like it's immune to fire, or this thing is poisonous, we will incorporate that into the stats, and basically check all the boxes that kind of meet player expectations. And there's of course like signature things like Mummy's Curse, where we'll make this complicated effect where you're rotting unless you cast a combination of cure disease. Is it cure disease and remove curse in that order?
Yeah, you gotta do it in the right order.
Yeah.
And then, have there ever been times when we've significantly, had to deviate from the source material, and what was that process like? Charles, we'll start with you and then see how it folded in on Brent's side of the fence.
Well, we picked the purple worm back in the day when we did it because it was such an iconic and memorable D&D monster. It's gigantic, it burrows under the ground, it can pop up unexpectedly, but that's not what people remember when they think about the purple worm. What they remember is when it swallows one of the players and digests them.
Yeah.
So how do you take that and adapt it to an MMO that's already been out for several years? And that's, when we go to Brent.
Yeah, I tried. So I got pretty close. The signature attack, the thing that happens in pen and paper, purple worm swallows your party member, starts to digest him. The party member is like hacking away at the inside with like a dagger. The party's hacking away at the purple worm. Party members getting digested. It's a race against time. And we got really close. We got the whole swallowing the player down. The player would be like invisible inside of the purple worm. If the worm moved, he'd move with them. We got it so the melee attacks were hitting the purple worm. They could still implement melee attacks. They weren't able to do other actions. We got most of that working. The thing that really we couldn't get done in time is if other things could damage the player in the combat space, like say the purple worm was like collaborating with like a drow sorcerer who was controlling it, the player could get hit by an incidental fireball and die inside of the worm's stomach, and there were other hazardous interactions and edge cases, and it was just a lot. So we decided to not try to do it systematically, as in not every worm would swallow the player and put them in their stomach. Instead, we built a custom dungeon that was basically to represent this experience where a truly gigantic purple worm swallows you and a bunch of angry drow, and you're all stuck in the stomach together. And it's an entire dungeon experience, in which case we were able to do that, and that whole dungeon is about, giving that worm indigestion to get out of there.
Yeah, that's a neat dungeon. There's all kinds of critters and things that you run across inside of them, so it was pretty neat.
And we just fixed the acid, so it's safe to go back in.
Yeah.
Relatively safe.
Well, as safe as a purple worm's stomach can be. So the next phase is a phase we like to lovingly refer to as giving monsters a home. So we have the monster, we have what it looks like, we have a bunch of its statting going. Eric and Charles, do you think that the monsters inform the setting, or that the setting informs the monsters?
Well, it's a bit of both, really. We build spaces for a monster. We want it to fit in the habitat that it was designed for. Like purple worms show up a lot underground, so they went into Underdark dungeons, stuff like that. But we also have to take the mechanics into account. On the other side, how much space does the monster need? Does it have a giant charging attack that needs runway space? Does it pin people to walls, stick them to the ceiling, stuff like that.
And we break down monsters into two basic types. One is what you might call your minion type, and those are guys you can run into in any old hallway and can be used in large groups. And that's a lot of our monsters. But then there are the other special monsters that, as Eric was just saying, require special treatment because of their mechanics. They're a Medusa and you want them to turn themselves to stone when they look in a mirror. Or it's the purple worm and it needs a huge amount of space. And sometimes it's just this monster needs a special environment because it needs to be dramatic. You don't want to run across Strahd in just any old hallway.
So speaking of those special spaces, obviously when it comes to setting up a lair or a boss room or encounter space, how do we figure that part out? So let's have Brent and Eric take this one.
One example, the room and environment a boss is in can really synergize with the mechanics that boss has. The room itself can have its own mechanics. It can be as simple as a fire elemental just fighting you inside a lava environment, and the fire elemental is immune to fire. But a more complicated but interesting one that comes to mind is we did this crocodile for Salt Marsh called 1,000 Teeth, giant crocodile. So if you're going to fight a giant crocodile, you probably want to fight it around water, give it kind of an edge in movement, and what we did is that we filled we basically had this cave with islands, and water not terribly deep, but enough the player swimming at a disadvantage, and the water is filled with crates that the player can jump on. But the thing is that the crates can be destroyed by the crocodile biting. So we'd have these experiences where you'd be on the island doing a puzzle, and 1,000 teeth would jump out at you, giant crocodile, and the player would panic and start running across these crates, and the crocodile would be chasing them, going clomp, 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 clomp. It's destroying the crates behind them, and that bridge wouldn't be there when they hit the next island, and they would basically realize they're running out of space and have to deal with him. But that's just one example.
Yeah, never forget the water's full of piranhas.
Yeah, the water's full of piranhas just because.
And other examples, like with the Medusa attack that Charles was speaking about, we want to give the players ability to break line of sight. We want to make sure that they have some mitigating mechanic that allows them to protect themselves from what's going on. So we have to factor all of those things in when we're building these spaces.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, At this point, the monsters are really starting to come to life. Here you can see the carrion crawler actually doing some crawling. So he's going through doing his various motions, and this is really when we're starting to get more into the polish phase. So for Eric and Sean, what does that final polishing stage look like from your perspective? How do we make the creatures really feel alive, really feel true to the book?
So usually what will happen is once we're getting close to considering the monster complete, we'll have an in-house review where we'll go through all the attacks it's doing, how it looks, how it's moving, how the animations went when they got animated. And once we're made all our changes and we're happy with it, we'll package the whole thing up and send it over to Sean. So Sean gets to see in Wizard's End and they can make their decisions.
Yeah, normally when somebody sends us a monster, I look at it, and if it's something that's like a purple worm or a carrion crawler, something I've been fighting carrion crawlers since I could roll a d20, so I'm usually enough of a brand expert to give it a thumbs up, and I give the team the go-ahead. If it's something like Vecna, and we've got a new Vecna book coming out, and there's like all these new rules for the brand, and I'll send that up above my pay grade and make sure that it's got a couple more eyeballs on it before I give it the thumbs up, just to make sure that it's got the full WotC stamp of approval. But it's in 99% of all cases, it's pretty easy to just approve it and send it back to the Standing Stone team because they do phenomenal work.
Thank you. How do we actually get the monster to do some of the stuff you're seeing up there as it's curling and it's lashing? Brent, how does that actually get done?
Well, once all the animations are done and the art asset is ready, it gets hooked up with a behavior, scripted behavior, basically like what's it going to do. What most monsters do is they attack the player. But we try to give them kind of a game plan that really matches like their lore and just in how the art asset came out. And also we like to try to put in kind of what we think of as a wrinkle in the gameplay. Like a little opening, or like it has a strength or a weakness that the player can exploit or avoid. Like one case I can think of is the Displacer Beast, who is, it's like a panther with these giant tentacles, and it's got great reach. It's like engagement range is something like 16 meters. And the Displacer Beast really wants to pound you with its tentacles. But if you get in close to it, kind of in its grill, it'll switch to its claw and bite attacks, which actually do half damage. And the Displacer Beast will also start to, not want to be in close range. So it'll start wasting actions, like trying to move away from you. So it's, we do all sorts of gambits, like, engagement range, or like it won't use this attack unless certain circumstances, or it will not use an attack if you have set up certain circumstances, and the players can figure this out, and really makes the monster feel like it's thinking.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to do a little round robin question for us all, which is, what's the number one polish task that you always need to do with monsters? Whatever that task is to make them feel better or heavier or smarter, or whatever that number one polish task is. I think I'm going to start with Dan. Number one polish task.
Sure. So we bake a lot of our lighting into our monster models. So a lot of my polish involves like hand painting light details into the model. If you have a very slimy creature, my job is to make it look super slimy. And those little details help it pop in game.
Charles, number one polish task.
The carrion crawler is looking very slimy indeed.
Very slimy.
What I'm doing right now is hooking up what we call entrance states, and those are things the monster is doing before it notices you, before the combat starts. It might be something like a howler eating something on the ground, or a Nothic looking around, or a couple of red wizards of Thay talking to each other. And those little bits and pieces make the monsters feel much more alive than if they're just kind of standing there looking at nothing. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing that with all the Mythdraenor monsters right now.
Great. Brent, number one polish task.
Playing the end result. Typically, I spend a lot of time, fighting the monsters, tuning their behaviors, but I'll be doing it like in a test room, and then I will hand them to the content team when they're ready, and the content team will do who knows what with them sometimes. So at the end, I basically play all the content and look at what the monsters are doing and how they're performing and, tweak from there.
Eric, number one polish task.
Usually my number one polish task at the end of this process is to actually go through and look at them in the world after they've been placed. See if we missed anything, like, we have a great entrance date for the carrying crawler, we have this, we have that, but we need it to pop out of a wall. It's like, all right, we've got to add a mechanic for it popping out of the wall.
And then how
Stuff
about you,
like that.
Sean? What's your number one?
I have a two-part answer. Number one is just approving it in our approvals portal. That's the number one. But one thing, I don't think you guys know this, but I always show a monster to my wife. And if she gives an ew, I'm like, all right,
Okay.
good.
The true sign of success.
He's real gross. Or sometimes it's a spooky. And I'm like, nice, he's supposed to be spooky. We did
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, my favorite polish task is the fact that we have to figure out how every monster dances. So that's my favorite, is because we have spells like Auto Resistible Dance, every single monster, we have to figure out exactly how is this thing gonna dance, no matter how many limbs it has or whether it's floaty. So it's always a creative endeavor to figure out how they're gonna do their dance moves. And you can see here, apparently our carrion crawler favors some thrashing. So there is your carrion crawler dance. Now, sometimes the work we do on monsters leads to even more monsters. So, Brent, what are some of the more challenging monsters that we've made? And then are there ever times where, because we've made one of these challenging monsters, it actually pays dividends?
So one of the biggest monster projects we did was the dragon, the revamped dragon. We called it the Dragon Kit. We had made dragons before the kit, but they were either young dragons, which were relatively the size of maybe like a large tiger or something, like in Giant Hold, or there was Vela, who's pretty stationary. But the Dragon Kit was we wanted it to fulfill all of our dragon dreams. So first of all, it had to handle a variety, at the very least, the 5 colors of the dragons, the chromatic colors of the bad dragons, and we wanted to be able to have 3 red dragons next to each other that looked different. So we had the short neck model, the medium neck model, the long neck model. They all had different features which could be customized and swapped out, like slight variations in texture, the wings, the tail, so we could have a large variety of dragons. But the real thing was, fighting them. We wanted them to feel heavy. We wanted to feel like we were, fighting this epic fantasy beast that occurs in so much literature. So one of the things we did that was really effective and really changed the paradigm is that we did animation turns, where most monsters you fight in our game, or a lot of MMOs, frankly, is they're being turned by a move to controller, which means they're pretty much turning on the dime. They just spin. And our dragons, when you're 90 degrees off on the side of a dragon, our dragon's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Or it's basically movement-based animations. The dragon will be like, I'm gonna do a 180. I'm gonna swing my tail, and everyone back there is taking the tail. I remember when we first created the Dragon Kit, we created them in Evening Star, and they had massive knockbacks on that tail. And you'd be in the cornfield outside of town, and you'd be watching players go. Pff.
Yeah.
And it gave us that really, it worked really great. And pretty much every time we build a big heavy monster now, we're like, can we do the turn-based animations? We did it on the giant crab in White Plume Mountain. Yeah. When a monster is big and memorable, we do this kind of movement, and it really helps the monster feel like you're fighting something big and massive.
Yeah, I remember some of the early, way early days of dragons. You'd walk up and you'd fight it, and you could kind of tell who it was fighting based on where it was facing. Just the whole body would just swing, like they were saying, just like a turret. But once we got the Dragon Kit, you'd come up to the dragon and you would see, it would be stomping on your friend, and you'd be behind it, and you would see the head swivel around and look at you. And you knew that it was yeah, I might be smashing your friend with my foot right now, but I see you. Favorite monster? So I'm going to start on the end. I'm going to start with Sean. What's your favorite monster from D&D?
Gelatinous cube, hands down.
Yeah?
Easy.
Love gelatinous cube.
For me, Black Dragon, probably.
That's a good one.
I can't play favorites.
What? All right.
For all those babies.
So somebody true neutral then.
Every monster deserves love.
Well, like the kobold is sort of the mascot of DDO. There's great warmness in my heart for the kobold. But in terms of Dungeons and Dragons as a whole, not just DDO, I'm going to make a controversial call here and say the best monster is the dragon.
Yeah.
Because it can be used, it's a great big monster. It's very impressive. But it's also intelligent and a spellcaster. It can control an entire country. It can be that guy at the bar who's looking at you somewhat strangely,
Yeah.
like thinking about how he's going to screw you over later in the campaign.
Dan, favorite monster?
Oh, boy. So this might be cheating, but for the Isle of Dread, I got to make a T-Rex for the game. That was pretty fun. I think I'll choose that.
The T-Rex was really good. Even the zombie T-Rex, right?
Oh,
That
yeah, we had a zombie T-Rex.
was very cool. And yeah, it's tough for me. I think my favorite, I have to go with Lich. Because the Lich in the book, to me, especially when I was first starting to play D&D, was super terrifying as a concept. And then in the game, they were no less terrifying to me. So I think Lich is probably my favorite. So we're going to break protocol a little bit for this panel. Now, you've heard us earlier say that the way we decide what monsters go in are, we're looking at, which classic ones are we missing or what is the story doing, but we're gonna do something a little different, which is we're gonna let you help us pick what is an upcoming monster for DDO. So, we're going to pick between these three awesome monsters. And what I'm going to have you do, we're going to be having online voting, and as well I'll want to hear some clapping today here in person, because we'll factor that in too. So let me hear the applause for who's excited to see an Etten in DDO. Etten fans? All right. All right, now who's on Team Intellect Devourer? I am on Team Intellect Devourer. And then let's see who's excited about getting a carionette. They're like an animated, carionette. Right. Yeah, that's great. The carionette, interesting. Wow. So we are going to be running this poll with the community. You can participate online. We've got a code here you can scan. You can vote for the next 2 weeks. And you can also, if you don't want to scan the code here, you can visit us on our social channels, and you can cast your votes there. But you'll have 2 weeks to let us know what monster do you want to see us add to DDO, and then in the next year or so, we will be bringing that monster to the game. So that is the beginning all the way through to the end of how we make monsters in Dungeons & Dragons Online. So it's really great to have everybody here, and it looks like we made such good time that we'll be able to field some questions. So thanks so much for coming, and then if you have questions, I believe that we have mics somewhere in the middle there. And if you have a question, you can feel free to walk up to the mic and ask us.
Can I just say that it sounded like the carionette was the wheel winner?
I like this.
Thank you.
I know, I'm excited.
Yeah, it's the Piddlewick lobby.
All right.
Hi, I had a question for you about sort of differences in monster size when it comes to design. If you have a monster that's really large, that's going to put some constraints on kind of where you can place it, how it's going to act, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on how that changes things.
Size. It definitely changes a couple of different things, right? Because really huge monsters require a lot different space to encounter than in the small monsters, and also how many of those can be in the encounter. What do you think?
I mean, so lots of times we have to build encapsulated boss room encounters. Typically a large monster will often be a boss. There's kind of a design decision where you basically be like, so you're fighting this monster, and do you want this fight to really go anywhere in this dungeon? Could they run all the way from back and forth to the beginning? Like, what physical spaces can be accessed? And then generally, like a lot of big monsters, we basically have to say, look, this is the boss room, and this is really true to most games, especially console, like physical, where physics gets involved, realistic physics games. In console games, they kind of had to do it for performance reasons for years. That you just have to basically say, this is the room we fight this monster in, and it's like we have to design an airlock. And sometimes we do very weird narrative reasons why there's an airlock, and sometimes we just throw a magic barrier up.
It's just an airlock. And obviously, if you're building Giant Hold, you have to build the space differently than if you're building a Cobalt dungeon. So, the monsters are broken down into different size groups, just like they are in the monster manual. There's small monsters, there's medium monsters, there's large. And they use different path maps. In other words, they figure out where to go using different mental maps of how the dungeon works. And when we're building content, we have to be very aware of that, because it's very easy to do things like make a dungeon with a, ogre or something, and then realize it can't fit through a doorway. That's where the magic barriers come from sometimes.
Generally, sometimes we'll mix it up. There was a shambling mound in the Ravenloft pack where we decided, like, we're not going to do a barrier here. We're going to, it's going to summon needle lights if they can't reach you. Just be like, I'm just going to make needle lights. Like, if you want to, hide in that back room where I can't go, I'm just going to send needle lights.
Yeah, and from the Wizards side, if we have a development partner like Standing Stone that says we want to make a displacer beast, but 10 stories tall, I'm like, that's why adjectives exist. You want to make a dire displacer beast, or you've got lesser, greater, whatever cub. We can certainly, if you have a really cool idea, we're totally willing to play ball and experiment with monster sizes.
Size also sometimes informs where we feel like putting them. Like if we have a really, cool creature like a Hydra, we might go, oh, maybe you don't just find a Hydra, in a little nook. You actually are going to need to find that someplace special. So size definitely comes into play for things like that.
Yeah, somebody once had an idea to make a very fat red dragon, and we were skeptical at first, but I think it was the right call.
Yeah. All right, let's come to this side of the room.
So I'm old enough to remember many of the decades of Dungeons & Dragons history and all of the creatures that evolved from the original TSR days. I'm just wondering, with all of that weight behind it, do you guys take a lot of inspiration from other media? Like, do you go and watch the latest Dune films, or watch Pacific Rim, or watch something and you go, that's really cool, and I want to incorporate that into the animations or the way that we set up something in D&D Online?
Who wants to take that one? I know we always tend to put little Easter eggs in different places, so I know it does happen. Usually they're subtle, because we obviously don't want to really break you from the D&D multiverse, but anybody have some good examples?
I do this all the time, and I'm trying to think of one.
Right.
It's like the zeitgeist. It's
Right.
like we're just going to reference something because we were watching it. It came out, we all watched it, we all loved it. And we just want to, they range from cultural references to like the B movie you loved 15 years ago.
I mean, we did do a tower defense dungeon back during in the Stormlords.
Yep.
Back when tower defense was the thing.
I'll just add in, go find the Dalek.
I mean, I remember when I did the Chronoscope, I named the villain Tremus, which was an anagram for master, which is the master from Doctor Who. I think, so, I mean, this, I'm trying to think of.
Yeah, often you'll see it come through the most in the titling of different dungeons, where we'll sometimes do plays on things that are trending, and sometimes not trending, sometimes just personal favorites. You'll notice there was a stretch of time where there was a bunch of dungeons that the names of them were references, slight nods to some popular metal music, particularly from the 80s. So those are always fun. And then there's a reference in one of the upcoming the Slice of Life pack. I'll see if y'all can spot it.
And sometimes we put in references where our players think they're references to different things. In Wayloon, there's a dungeon called Through a Glass Darkly, which apparently is the name of a metal song, not one that I'm familiar with. But, it's also from the Bible, but that's where I took it. So.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, we all consume the same pop culture, and it just gives us a great shorthand to speak with each other. If somebody's like, hey, we want this to be like the Indiana Jones boulder moment, I know what that means. You just saved us 2 hours of explaining what this is. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of those great pop culture moments get used by us.
Yes, I think you all know where our rolling boulder came from.
Yeah, more than once. Let's go to this side.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for all you guys do. I've been playing for 15 years, one of my favorite games. My question was actually, how do you guys decide once you've developed the expansion and the quest lines, how do you decide what level ranges to put them in?
Well, so we always do cap on the legendary side of things because people want higher level loot, so that part's easy. After that, for a while it was about filling in gaps, which we definitely still do a little bit. We need to actually do a little bit in the mid-epics still. We revamped Catacombs, and we had a gap, so we added, in the epic line. We're kind of actually out of gaps in the heroic. Heroic is pretty good. I would say we definitely this level range hasn't gotten love, as in they've been playing the same stuff, in this level band, and it's time to shake things up.
Yep. There are some times where the content does, suggest a level band. In other words, if we're we want to do Salt Marsh, well, Salt Marsh should really be a low-level pack. Keep on the Borderlands should be a low-level pack. And if you're doing, your big confrontation with Vecna after who knows many years worth of storyline, that should probably be a higher level pack.
Yeah.
But there are some things, where it could be anything. Mythdraenor could be anything. Feywild could be anything. So sometimes it is just a question of filling in the gap.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, let's come to this side.
So this is a question, that's a really sensitive mic. Less about DDO and more just for you guys. Have you guys ever homebrewed monsters, or from the wizard side, the process behind creation of monsters? How did you feel about that? How'd you, if you?
So we, in DDO, one of the earliest, what I'll call homebrew monster that we had was something called a flesh render, and then there was a fire reaver and an ice flenser as well. Those creatures didn't exist in D&D before, so what we tried to do was envision something that was still, taking all of the knowledge, because all of us play D&D, in addition to working on a D&D video game, we love tabletop, right? And so trying to think through, okay, these are the kinds of things that you run into, and that's sort of, we built out a stat block essentially for it, did concept art for it, talked back and forth with the Wizards team, hey, would this be okay? And then sometimes we do custom monsters because there's a particular story element that's happening. Charles, I'm trying to remember, are the Taken technically
The
ours?
Taken are homebrew,
Yeah.
and because we wanted to tell a very particular story. So we're like, hey, Wizards, can we make up this monster? And they're like, yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm. In the case of Sharn, we wanted to have sort of metallic insects as worker drones down in the cogs. And I had a list of different official Dungeons and Dragons monsters. And I kept talking to Wizards about it, and should we do this one? And they're like, well, but that one actually is from a different setting. Mm-hmm. Et cetera, et cetera. And after going through the list, they're like, you can make up a monster if you want to. so we did. We made a mechanical beetle.
Mm-hmm. And then Sean, on the wizard side, obviously you're making new books all the time. Tell us a little bit about how that goes.
Yeah, sure. I am a little bit removed from the TTRPG studio. I sit in some of the meetings, but at the end of the day, I think anybody who's even read the first page of a Dungeon Master's Guide has gotten to the point where it says, do the coolest thing always, and if you don't like a rule, change it. And that's a philosophy that I bring to working with our partners. If we have a partner that says, hey, we want to do this thing and it's really awesome, first thing I look at is, does it already exist? Does it need to be a new thing? Because a lot of people will say, we want to make this thing. And I'm like, that's just a skeleton with extra steps, right? But yeah, if people have an awesome idea and it's a thing we haven't done yet, if it fulfills a meaningful story role or fulfills like a niche that they need to fill inside of a dungeon or for a specific game mechanic, we're almost always open to it. It's just a matter of making sure that it's done in a way that feels great, because when you have a game that's been out as long as DDO, it's important to understand that people look at new contributions that DDO makes as introductions into Forgotten Realms canon, and so we want to make sure that it's viewed in a way that people can bring it into their game without feeling like it's a mismatch for the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or whatever setting. So yeah.
And ultimately, we spend a lot of effort to make sure if we're going to make like a new custom kind of monster, it still has to feel like D&D. Like ultimately, whatever that creature is, it still has to feel like something that you would expect to see. And there's lots of subtle ways that can that you have to notice to feel whether something is really kind of, ooh, this doesn't quite feel right. Why doesn't it feel right? And you're like, is it the way that it's, the anatomy of it? Does it have elements that I've just never really seen elsewhere in the D&D universe? So you're trying to make sure that when you see something new, that it still feels like it belongs in the D&D universe. All right,
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
and then we'll take the next person there.
Hello. For me, I'm like brand new into D&D. I've kind of known friends who've played D&D over the years. I only been part of like one campaign. I was wondering, what is something that you could probably like, for those who are like brand new, I mean, D&D's been around for like almost 50 years or so. What's like some advice you would give for someone like me or for anybody else who's like brand new into it to like how to get into D&D essentially?
Well, you're right on the money. It is 50 years this year. It's the DD's 50th birthday. I forget the exact date. It's written down somewhere. I should know it. My biggest piece of advice to anybody getting into D&D for the first time, it's two parts. Well, first off, I have a rule: if I start a new campaign, there has to be a new player at the table. I always invite somebody that's never played before. They're not hard to find. We've got, D&D is exploding in popularity. You've got, Stranger Things. We've got a lot of new avenues. We're bringing in a lot of new blood. So please, if you guys play tabletop, find people that want to play and don't have a table yet and invite them and teach them. We don't want to eat our young as a community. We want to make sure that we're passing it on to as many people as possible. Don't gatekeep. But as a new player, I will just say, understand what you like about D&D and communicate that with your group, because it is, at the end of the day, it's just collaborative storytelling. And if you don't tell your DM, or if you are DMing, if you don't tell your players what you enjoy, there's always going to be friction at the table. The best campaigns I've ever been a part of are where there's just really good communication outside the game about what you enjoy inside the game.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to actually reference the book. You don't have to lean on the book, but the book is very helpful if you're just getting started. Like, let's say that in your group, what was really common for some of my friends back in the day was everybody wanted to play, but they were like, well, we don't have a dungeon master. Who's going to be the dungeon master person? That sounds complicated. But the books are there to help guide that process. So when you come to a point where you're like, I don't know, what should I do? It's right there. You can just go in and reference, and then you can do a little table talk with each other. It's big. Communication with everybody as you're playing is like a big part of it. Does that help? Awesome, thank you. I think we have one over on this side.
So you mentioned the consideration of introducing a new monster into a sort of established MMO. There are some things that DDO doesn't generally do, like flight, I think, only ever exists in Giant
In Giant Hold.
In Giant Hold.
Yeah.
When you're looking at a new monster that has some sort of ability that DDO hasn't touched on before, how do you sort of decide when it's worth breaking with that established norm?
You want to take this one, Brad?
Sure. When we decide to do a creature, like creatures have complicated mechanics, like let's take the Hydra. The Hydra's actually going to be pretty complicated. Like we're basically undertaking, you're slicing a head off. It's got 5 of them. Like what order do they fall off in? Is there an order? How does the monster fight when it's down 2 heads? Are the heads still fighting, the ones that you've cut off? what does the player do about the fact the Hydra regenerates the heads? How does it stop? How does the player stop that? And that's a big complicated system, and so often like one of the things that we often have to deal with, which is outside of the creative element, we actually have to analyze how much time it's going to take and like what deliverable this monster is going to be in. So some monsters are basically just a lot more expensive than other monsters, and we basically have windows of opportunity based on our development schedule to approach certain monsters. And it's just kind of how things line up. It's like typically the expansions are when we have a bigger development schedule, so it's when we're more likely to be ambitious about a really complicated monster. Flight, which you brought up, often is heavily related to actually the dungeon space. It's not just about the monster flying. We basically had limited flight monsters for a while. There's a dungeon in the Sharn Pack that actually got monsters chasing you in the air while you were flying. And that basically was like the result of like, I think our third attempt at getting that kind of mechanic to work. And it just started to come together in Sharn, and there's still kind of like edge cases we're still working it out, which is why but we could have like an expansion that is very flight-based in the future now that we've kind of built up in that foundation. It really has a lot to do with kind of like us developing the technology, the time it takes, and then sometimes we're literally iterating through multiple passes and attempt a mechanic.
And because we're an older game, there are times when we're like, okay, this is very difficult, we're not sure if we can do it. The good news, though, is that as we have been doing this for a while, we build up experience, and we suddenly realize, yes, sometimes we can do these things. The Hydra is a monster where, like, I started on DDO, people are like, we're never going to do the Hydra.
Yeah.
And we're doing the Hydra.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, we'll come over here.
Hi, so I've been playing DDO since like 2007, 2008, whenever it went free to play. One of the things that I always think about a lot when playing the game is the range of power levels that happens throughout the game naturally. I mean, it's almost 20 years old now. Playing through Waterworks as a completionist is a lot different than doing it as a new player.
Yeah.
How do you go about balancing that for the various tiers of play? Because like you also have missions that are both heroic and legendary, and I imagine there's a lot of decision making that goes into how you figure out what ranges you're planning the content for.
The one sentence answer is add more difficulty levels.
Yeah.
Reaper was a part of that, right? We wanted to continue to let people sort of continue to push the bleeding edge of what they can do, but we don't want everybody to have to do that if that's not their speed. So difficulty has been a huge boon to us in that regard. Brent, what else do we do?
I mean, it is really mostly about the difficulty levels. I mean, DDO, so you have an incredibly customizable character base, like the multi-classing system. There's so many permutations. We have the reincarnation system where you could have like an elder player who's like reincarnated 35 times, knows, basically is a complete master of the games, knows the content like the back of their hand, has, all these advantages. And we just have to have, we implemented 10 additional difficulty levels with Reaper to basically like fill that need. And, to let the player basically pick the difficulty that is best for them or their party.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I'm not sure which of you came first, so we'll go left. All right.
My question is related, and there are some areas where the difficulty selection process isn't fully available yet. For example, the best raid in the game is Tower of Despair, obviously, and it's not yet legendified. Is that something we could ever expect?
So we often talk about whether or not to revisit older raids or older content packs for that matter, because in some cases the amount of effort it takes to go through and epify them is as much as it would take for us to build you something brand new. And so that's always our sort of balancing act of, do they want something new? Would they enjoy revisiting this old one? So it's never off the table, but we sort of try to, especially lately, we're trying to err on the side of bringing people new things. And if there's things about previous content that are really beloved or it's filling a certain niche in the gameplay, we're more likely to revisit something when it's doing that. And I think we'll have time for one last question. And so we'll take you, here will be our last question.
All right. I wanted to say thank you for Hardcore. I've been playing since the very beginning, day one when y'all went live. And the old days where you had XP deficit if you died in a dungeon.
I remember that.
I mean, it really, got the juices flowing, and all it took was for one guy to Leroy Jenkins, and next thing you know, you're coming out with less XP than you went in with. But with Hardcore, it kind of brings a lot of that back now, and it forces you to group up, and with the combined servers, you learn how to, because servers start to figure something out, the word spreads, and then you get into just a routine of doing the same thing. With all the other servers coming in, you learn how they're doing it, and it adds a little bit to the game. But now, we're so deep into it. I was thinking, you guys have some amazing ideas with Hardcore. Can we bring them all together into one season?
So you want to run all the mechanics at once?
All at once. I want to die in a horrible way.
Yeah. You're like getting chased by the hounds, but also...
Yes, and the Mimic event at the same time.
Yeah.
All of it. Hyper champs, mimics, hounds, the whole thing.
This is my pet project in the back of my head that I had not told them about yet. Which is like all
I'll
of
give
these,
you the pin
to be
code to my
modular,
ATM
right?
if you do that.
Say again?
I'll give you the pin code to my ATM card if you do that.
Yeah, no, we liked, when we started doing the Redux seasons, we were like, you know what, at any time, what would happen if I start like combining some of these? It's totally possible, and we just have to look for any intersections where there's any that sort of conflict, where they would like cause something bad to happen mechanically. But that is a thing that I have had on my radar. It's like, okay, what if I do like a mega season?
If there's a conflict and the character dies, if there's a conflict and a character dies for any reason on Hardcore, you guys say it, right?
Yeah.
Roll a new character. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Well, thanks to everybody for coming out to see us today. Thank you so much. If you are a member of the press, we will have you meet with Joy, and we'll be meeting outside. And then if you came late and you didn't get a pin, because we have these awesome commemorative DDO pins, you will want to see Wes, who's there in the back on your way out, and then to also head out. But thank you so much for coming. It's been really great to see everybody. And then I'm going to throw the QR code up here if anybody still needs it. You got 2 weeks to tell us which monster's going in, although it does sound like one particular monster has a head start. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.